Well, I've got right at 11. So, Laura, you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. Well, good morning, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well today, this Thursday. Thank you for joining us today with Mr. Jordan and this Dr. Debbie. I was going to submit Dr. Debbie Phillips. Today, we're going to be digging deeper into, as far as what our ongoing subject of peeling back the layer of the onion, talking about budgets and marketing. So thank you again for being here. A little background as far as ALN and our data trends and how we do our research. ALN started in 1991 just with a basic locator program. Since then, online was created for the real estate professional in 1993, and our market coverage platforms have grown to what ALN is known for today, data with integrity. Over the last 11 years, ALN has developed 2 additional platforms and added markets across the country to complete our nationwide footprint. ALN covers over 180 plus markets to include primary, secondary, tertiary markets. In other words, we don't want a sample of a market, but everything in it. It's our main goal every time. Our products that consist of conventional, affordable, student, senior independent, and senior affordable. Our database contains all property age categories. Majority of our platforms are based on 50 units or more, which are being tracked every 25 business days. So ALN has been tracking data for some time now. We love our histories and our trends and continue to track and evaluate those. As ALN has grown, so has multifamily, not only new products or properties being constructed, but growth in technology, as well as growth in the employment sector. ALN continues to provide multifamily professionals the tools they need to make decisions and stay competitive in the nation's fastest growing markets. And we're also consistently updating and redefining those data points to ensure our quality holds true for the client's expectations. So as we grow, as the industry grows, we continue to peel back the layers of those onions regarding data, trends, historicals, and product and technology, excuse me. Happy to be here, happy to share information, looking forward to seeing what Jordan and Dr. Debbie have to find. Thank you both.
Thank you, Laura. And I'm going to just go ahead and start. We're going to jump in, and we're going to structure this for anyone that was on our initial webinar. We're going to structure this one a little bit differently. Instead of doing just a long PowerPoint presentation, we're going to have some data and slides to show you in the PowerPoint, but we're going to mix in a little bit more discussion as well. And Debbie's going to give us some great content as well. So let me get. Oh, Debbie, looks like I need you to enable screen share.
Sure thing. There we go. Hang on just a second. And there you go.
All right. And are we seeing my slide?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So Laura just gave us a great background on ALN. So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip that. But I did want to give you a little bit more detail on our research methodology to give you some background on the numbers that we're going to be looking at. So as Laura mentioned, we do all of our research in-house. We're not relying on third-party data providers. We track all price classes, and we do our price classes a little bit differently than some data providers. So we assign each conventional property in a market to a price class A, B, C, or D, according to its average effective rent per square foot percentile in its market. And so what that does is it allows us to compare similar properties relative to their placement in their market across markets. We do focus our regular research updates on conventional properties of at least 50 units. And for the most part, that's going to be the numbers that we're looking at here today, conventional properties, at least 50 units. And we do collect, as I said, we rely on collected data. We're not doing just market sampling. We're contacting these properties every month. Okay, so before jumping into a couple of, some of our multifamily data, I wanted to show, just by way of some context, the job situation that the economy is in right now. So on this first slide, what we're looking at is labor force. And you can see the total civilian labor force, the employed civilian labor force, and then of course the unemployment rate. And that axis on the right-hand side is going to be the unemployment rate. And a couple of things noticeable here. First of all, you do see a nice downward trajectory, not a V necessarily, the V-shaped recovery, but we do have a nice downward trajectory in the unemployment rate. The less encouraging side of that, though, is that you can see that we still are pretty substantially, about 5 million or so, below the total labor force that we had even earlier this year. So we do have a significant number of people not only unemployed, but we've got a significant number that for now have left the labor force. So the other economic information here that I wanted to show is basically just jobless claims. And on the left-hand side, we're looking at initial claims, which are a leading indicator then for the right-hand side, which are the continued jobless claims. And I put this together before, I think the latest numbers came out yesterday. So we did continue a downward trend, both in the initial claims and the continued claims that as of the most recent data. But on here, on the left-hand side, again, with the initial claims, you can see just a massive historic uptick there in April, a pretty good downward trajectory since then. But if you look there on the right-hand side of that graph, you can see that we're still about 3 times as high on a weekly basis as we were in the first quarter of 2020. So still pretty elevated, though, of course, not near those kind of apocalyptic peaks from earlier in the year. And then on the continued claims side, a little bit stickier there. And that's why you've seen the more shallow downward trajectory in the unemployment rate. But nonetheless, we do have a downward trend that's been established, really since the end of April. So, and one other thing to point out too is just, we're down to less than 1 million initial claims a week, which is a huge number, obviously, but again, down substantially from where we were. But on the continued claims, you can see just an order of magnitude difference where we're still, hovering just below 10 million. So definitely has been a rocky year. And before we get into some specifics from the multifamily perspective that we really wanted to focus on in this webinar, things like differences between price class performance and floor plans, I wanted to give you just kind of a big picture look at multifamily more broadly before we kind of zoom in on that. So to start with, we're just going to do kind of basic supply and demand here. So we've got new units delivered and absorbed units. And 2020 on the far right there, it's year to date, but we're actually on pace to match or maybe even slightly surpass the new supply from these previous 3 years. We're going to probably land somewhere between 285, 300,000, somewhere in there. So new supply definitely has not, dipped like we thought earlier in the year it might. And what has dipped though is net absorption. You can see that even given that that's year to date and we've still got a full quarter left, these numbers I should mention are as of the end of September. So net absorption lower than 2019 and these previous years, even on a sort of pace basis. But if you look at net absorption from January to September in 2019, and you compare it to the same period so far this year in 2020, we're at about 70% of the 2019 figure. So new supply on pace to be about equal, demand on pace to be pretty substantially lower. And in fact, that 70% mark is after Q3 when demand actually outpaced Q3 2019. So we had a strong third quarter, but it wasn't enough to make up for that rough second quarter. So there's a lot to look at here, but on the left-hand side, we're looking at average effective rent per unit, and that's, well, I should say average rent per unit. And then on the right-hand side, that axis is the average occupancy value. So a couple of things to point out here. The first is, if you look at the top of that golden, sort of gold yellow portion, that is the average rent, average effective, average asking rent rather. And the top of the green, the blue region, is average effective rent. So basically what we're looking at here is what's the average asking and what's the average collected. And then the difference, the width of that gold region, is going to be your lease concessions. And so you can see that concessions have really re-entered the market, but that really predated COVID. And that's something that we're going to see on a couple of slides throughout this presentation, is that obviously the pandemic has had a major impact on multifamily, but we shouldn't attribute all of what's been going on this year to just the pandemic. We did see a little bit of softening coming into the pandemic, whether you look at declining rent growth the last few years and increasing concessions. So you can see really that in 2019, we really began to get a little more concessions coming into the market. And then once the pandemic hit this year, we saw another expansion. And you can also see the seasonality of our industry with that average occupancy line. The big difference this year, of course, is that average occupancy normally bottoms out around February or March. And in this year, those occupancy declines really continued through the May-June timeframe before ticking back up a little bit. So also, I did put the axis, the average occupancy axis that way intentionally. You'll notice that there's not much difference between those tick marks there, but that really is there to illustrate kind of the seasonal nature of that line. But the silver lining there then is that really we're down, less than a full % nationally in average occupancy between September of 2018 and September of 2020. So it's not like there's been some massive loss in occupancies at a national level, but we didn't get the seasonal bounce in 2020 that we normally do in those middle 2 quarters. And then one reason why rent growth hasn't been particularly strong is, of course, the reemergence of lease concessions. And on the left-hand side, we're looking at the % of conventional properties offering a discount. And on the left-hand side, we're looking at the average value of that discount. And we calculate this value, the average, amongst only properties that are offering a concession. So we're not including all of the zeros in there to drive an average down. So this is the average value of those properties that are offering a discount. And you can see that the pandemic's effect is particularly noticeable on the average concession value side, because you can see really that strong linear move up since the end of the first quarter of this year. On the % of properties offering a lease concession, that upward trend had already kind of been established since about middle of last year, actually. And so again, that's another, this is another point where we can see that there was some softening for multifamily that predated the onset of the pandemic, and that shows up really here in the pre-COVID portion of late 2019. We saw concessions on the rise. And I should point out too, on the right-hand side there, you can see that we're at a national level, we're at almost, essentially a month free off of a 12-month lease. So that's we're getting to a pretty substantial level of concessions. And of course, on a market-to-market basis, that can vary pretty widely, and there are markets that are well above that. Okay, and so how do we put all this together? Occupancy, rent, concessions. Basically, we look at net rent, right? So this is where we're factoring in both rent and occupancy to get an idea of what is the net rent per unit that we're looking at. And again, on a national level, you can see that actually net rent has been flat once again since before the pandemic hit. So we're really looking at end of Q2, opening of Q3, somewhere in there, we saw rent tailing off. And since then, we've essentially been flat, as you can see, for the last 12 months. Also keep in mind that this doesn't include any measures of inflation or anything like that. So the fact that rents from a net rent perspective are the same as a year ago, you also have to factor in that's going to be, if anything, a slight loss because of inflation. And as with occupancy, I said we didn't get the seasonal bounce in the middle quarters in occupancy. You can see the big difference in net rent is we had this nice upswing through those middle quarters of 2019 that did not materialize in 2020. Okay, and I think this is actually a good stopping point to bring in Debbie and get a little bit of information about what we can say about budgets given this net rent picture.
Well, thank you, Jordan, and welcome to everybody on the presentation today. I wanted to just take a minute and remind us, and it's like I shared with Laura and Jordan when we were preparing for this. I want you to think about the 4 legs of a table, high top table. You know, if you've ever eaten at a restaurant where one of them was out of kilter, you knew how miserable that feeling could be. And as we approach budgets right now, we're asking ourselves, should we look at zero-based budgeting? You know, what do we do about our resident retention? And I want to remind us all of the 4 obligations that we have to the owner. So if you're taking notes, I want you to write this down. Number 1 is we run a business to make a profit. So we've got to enhance the value of the asset. That's our Uncle formula. We perform as a fiduciary, and we provide a safe and healthy living environment for our residents. Now, when we're looking at budgeting, we've all learned about our controllables and our uncontrollables. I want Jordan in a few minutes to talk about, the demand for certain unit types. As he mentioned, we didn't get necessarily that bump that we usually get through May and June. I always say nobody likes to move their turkey or their tree. It's really hard to move those 3 bedrooms. So when we have inventory, and I grew up back in the Stone Age where we didn't have revenue maximization and revenue management software, but anytime your unit availability falls below 10%, you want to try to look at raising rents. So I really, one of the key takeaways from this presentation today is I want you to look at what I call kind of micro marketing. Look at your units and think about what target audience is appealing to those specific units. We know right now that more people are using that larger space for that office. So that 2-bed or the 3-bedroom could then become a 2-bedroom with office. We also know, and Faith Popcorn wrote about this many years ago, she talked about cocooning. And we are seeing that students are living longer with their parents. People are doubling up. We are seeing more roommate situations. And then I want to turn our attention back to this whole notion of budgeting. Ancillary income. How do we handle do we get any ancillary income from renting out the clubhouse? We may not get that. So therefore, we're going to have to make those special units more attractive. So when Laura and I were growing up in the industry, we would call it merchandising and mini models. And I want you all to think about looking at your inventory by product type, by floor plan, the aged vacants, because it's just like bread or milk on the shelf. People know when it's older and you're clamoring to the back of the cooler to get the fresh milk. People are looking for those fresh units. So pay attention to your inventory, pay attention to your programming and your resident retention, where you may not do as much offsite marketing and what we call corporate marketing. You may now turn your attention and what I call goose up or add a little bit more budget to your resident programming. The other thing is resident referrals. People like and know people like themselves. So I want you to think about that. And then I want Jordan to speak to unit types and product classes, because here's the deal. We know right now that workforce housing, restaurant and hospitality has been hit the hardest. Okay, so you want to turn your attention to your marketing for your traveling salespeople, your managers, your white collar workers that are saying, hey, we may not be going back to the office, so we're going to need extra space. Think about your business offices, think about your resident services. Do you have relationships with your pet groomers, your vets, your FedEx Kinkos? I mean, think about all the services that you can partner with people around your community to build that sense of community. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about the 5 things that you need to look at your budget to look at growing your NOI despite uncertainty in this economic situation. Jordan?
Thank you, Debbie. And I'll just add to that really quickly too. Every time these surveys come out about amenities that residents really value, we think about things like dog washing stations. And I saw somebody do a presentation about wine coolers in the unit and all this, which is very nice. But most residents, their top concern, and especially now probably, is Wi-Fi, right? So just something to think about too, is you want to make sure for those people working at home, you have the infrastructure in place. And yes, just as Debbie said, we're gonna move to a floor plan view now. And here we're looking at average collected rent per square foot. And for the most part, we're going to be looking at things on a per unit basis. But I wanted to include this just to give you an idea of how much more expensive on a per foot basis the efficiency units are. Because as we'll see in the coming slides, efficiency units have been particularly hard hit. Some of that has to do with people wanting more space if they're home more and things like that. But some of it has to do just simply with basic economics. These are very expensive units on a per square foot basis, and we've seen a price sensitivity increase this year that's pretty dramatic. So the other thing that I wanted to point out here for you is ALN does track units with dens as separate from those overall units. And so you can see here that for the 1 bedroom and the 1 den, there's not really a rent premium for the 1 den. But when you move to the 2 and the 3 bedroom, you do get a rent premium for the dens. And that goes perfectly with what Debbie was just saying. In some cases, you can get a 3 bedroom and turn it into a 2 plus an office. In some cases, you're just going to get a 2 bedroom with a den. And so something there to kind of keep your eye on. We'll see in a few more slides. There's not really a whole lot of evidence from a pricing mechanism perspective of a huge surge in demand for these units with the den, but just bear in mind that for the 2s and the 3s, you do get a little bit of a rent premium with the den. So here we're looking at average effective rent on a per unit basis again, and on the left-hand side, we're looking at the last 12 months. On the right-hand side, we're looking at just the third quarter and just the third quarter change specifically. So on this left-hand graph, you've got the average rent on your left-hand axis and your percent change on the right-hand axis with those yellowish gold dots. And as I was saying, you can see here the efficiencies are the only unit type to have suffered a rent retraction in the last 12 months. The other unit types all managed to at least break 0%, but you can see that really the only notable rent increase was in those 3 bedrooms and the 3 dens. So again, going back to what Debbie said, we have seen additional bedrooms performing better, and better is, of course, a relative term in 2020, but some decent rent growth there for the 3 bedrooms. And then in the third quarter, like I said, one of the big takeaways in the third quarter from ALN's perspective, at least, was that demand came back. And third quarter demand this year was stronger than third quarter demand last year. We didn't see that on the rent front. We didn't see the impact on rents. And efficiencies here, you can see in the third quarter, really had a hard time. So for the most part, units were able to build a little bit on rents, maybe defend rent, not have any real attraction, but efficiencies were pretty hard hit there. And as I said, in terms of the pricing mechanism being an approximation of demand for us, you can see that the 2 dens and the 3 dens really not nearly as strong on the rent growth as just the regular 2s and 3s. And of course, when we talk about rents, we have to talk about concessions. And the first thing you'll notice, well, I should point out once again, so the percent of conventional properties offering a discount, that's going to be on your left-hand axis, and that's going to be the blue bars. On the right-hand axis, you have your annual percent change for that availability. And so you can see that, of course, the 1 dens and the 2 dens, a lot of concessions along with the efficiencies. And then also the biggest growth in concessions over the last year has actually been, again, the efficiencies, the 1 dens and the 2 dens. So again, as we see the rents are a bit higher, you get more space, obviously, if you have a den, but we've not seen any massive movement toward really strong rent growth for these units with the den. So just, that's something to keep in mind. And Debbie, do you want me to go ahead and go through price class and then we'll?
Yeah, I'll finish this slide, and then I want to talk a little bit about what we can do concessions and talk about that. So cover this one.
Okay, so yeah, this is our first look from a price class perspective, and I've done kind of the same thing on this one, and you'll notice though that the difference is that we're comparing 2019 to 2020, along with breaking things down by price class. So I know it's kind of a lot to digest. But once you get your head around this, I think it's really useful. So we're basically looking at the first 3 quarters of 2019 compared to the first 3 quarters of 2020 on this left-hand graph. And you can see that actually for the Class A properties, not only is occupancy lower than it was in September of 2019, but they really got hammered on on the average occupancy front in general so far this year, nearly a 4% loss. Keep in mind with that, some of this has to do with new supply coming online is mostly going to be Class A. Occasionally in these large markets, you'll get the odd B. That's a new property, but for the most part, the Class A is dealing with new supply. Even so, though, you'll notice that last year by this time we had a pretty nice occupancy increase, even given that. So there's been a softening in Class A for sure. Occupancy is a little bit lower in Class B also, and Class B moved negative as well this year after being mostly stagnant last year on an occupancy front. And then C and D, classes C and D, we've seen really strong demand there. Not a huge uptick in occupancy. And on the right-hand side, I wanted to show you in the third quarter, again, just a really, I think this really kind of makes clear the difference that we've seen this year is that third quarter is when we really, like I said, would typically see some occupancy growth, some rent growth. That wasn't really so much the case here, except for, as you can see, Class D. Got a little bit of a bump on the occupancy front. And again, that goes back to sort of a flight to affordability. But Debbie, let's go ahead and let's talk about some floor plans before we move on.
Well, and I want all of you right now in your notes, I want you to write, and I reminded you in our last presentation, you never want to compete on price. You always want to compete on value. Okay. So when Jordan talks about, some of the C and D product, what that's indicating is people are wanting value. And when you see such new supply coming into the marketplace, it's like that old Kenny Rogers song, you got to know when to hold them and you got to know when to fold them. So you want to know when to hold them. You got to know that your residents and people, and I hate it when people say, well, we're in the middle of a pandemic, where are they going to go? Well, Jordan has just pointed out, people have more choices. And what people are saying in a lot of focus groups is they don't want more choices, they want better choices. So you want to make sure in your budget and in your marketing that you stay on message and you answer the question, why should they live there? Okay. The other thing that I wanted to make a note of, and this is when we're talking about controllables and uncontrollables, I want you to just what I call, Michael Jordan, he always said, the minute you get away from the fundamentals, the bottom can fall out. Okay. And this is a great time for all of you to perk up your people. What do I mean by that? Don't stop shopping, mystery shopping, and looking at the quality of the people on the sales floor. Now, I'm not talking out of school, Jordan, but I will tell you, I called some competitors this week, just checking some prices, and it took like 4 and 5 times to get somebody on the phone. So I don't know if they're in some kind of post-pandemic malaise or they're somewhere in the, air fogger that they don't hear the phone. I don't know what's happening, but there's no substitute for having somebody, what I call in the ready chair. And, these offices are opening back up. You got to have those and always, I like having and establishing a competitive floor. What do I mean by that? 2 aggressive leasing consultants, you put them on the leasing floor and one's going to outperform another one. So you got to have competition. Competition breeds creativity. And so I don't want us to take our eyes off of our people. You got to perk them up. You got to make sure that they know their inventory. Okay, just because they're looking at an available status sheet on the computer, they have to tie that in to what the caller, what the guest, and I don't ever like to call them prospects because that implies maybe they will, maybe they won't. Okay, so number 1 is perk up your people. Number 2 is sell value over price. Okay. You've got to let your salespeople sell that apartment in front of you, because if they can't sell it to you, I guarantee you they can't sell it to somebody else. Okay. Then the number 3 thing that I want to talk about just very briefly is product quality. Okay, you got to make sure that those available units are what I call spit shined and mini market. You got to mini market, you got to merchandise them. When I go in there and I walked some units in Virginia just a couple days ago, and somebody said, "Oh, well, I should have caught that. I should have caught that." You got to have ownership. So the product has to be crisp. Okay. And you know as well as I know, we used to do it, Laura, we used to call it a hot sheet, where we would take those that available inventory and we would break it down and say, here's what we've got to lease today. Pick out 5 or 6 different vacant apartments and give that to the leasing team. See, if they could do it at your level, they'd have your job, but they don't. You gotta break it down for your sales team. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is promotion. When Jordan shows us that an efficiency that we are having to give a concession on efficiencies, let me share this. This is a great one right there. Let's talk about this just for a minute. When you see the highest concession on an efficiency, I want to tell you this. Never call it a concession. Always call it an incentive. See, there's a big difference in the word concession and incentive. Okay, so an incentive is creating urgency. All right. So the way to merchandise and to get those efficiencies off your availability sheet is to do this. You got to look for people that don't stay there all the time. Maybe they, have a house someplace else. I call it the dinks, the double income, no kids. Laura has a lake house. People want, and particularly in the urban centers where Jordan is pointing out that you've got more softness in that market, look at marketing those efficiencies to people that have what I call second homes. They have a primary resident and they need just a place to what I call a crash pad. Okay, so that's how to get those efficiencies off the books. The 1 bedrooms, okay, you see that concessions were about 17, 18%. When you look at a 1 bedroom, I always say market to people who don't need a lot of interference. What do I mean by that? That's nurses, that's doctors, that's people, I say, say goodbye to fights over the bathroom and say hello to carefree, affordable living. Think about everybody that needs a 1 bedroom. Okay, those are people that need peace and quiet. The 1 bedrooms with dens, you see the largest concessions right there, almost 25% had lease concessions on the 1 bedroom with den. Now, that's probably the reason that people are saying, hey, I'm opting for value. I don't need that little bit of extra space. And that's why it's pushing demand back into the 1 bedrooms, or they're saying, hey, for just a little bit more money, I can go to the 2 bedroom. That's why you're seeing some of those lower concessions in the 2 bedroom. So it goes back to people, price, product, and promotion. First of all, you got to have aggressive salespeople. The product has to look crisp. You got to have it clean as a whistle, and you got to present it to your audience where you don't give them too much to choose from. One of the biggest mistakes salespeople make is they look at a big inventory sheet, and a lot of these websites, you can see how many apartments are available. That's why your people have to be very specific about what they're trying to lease that day. And just one other thing on the budgeting, I want you to look at your contracts. You know, a long time ago, it was probably a good idea to sign long-term contracts because you could probably get a better price. But now I want to suggest to you to have shorter term contracts so that you have more flexibility in your decision making. The other thing is, when you're walking your inventory, look at your utilities. Is the air conditioning running full blast, or is it at a, you know, an adjustable level? So what I'm saying is, look for the pennies right now. In budgeting, every penny counts. And that's what I want to impose and suggest. And the other thing is, a lot of you are thinking, hey, do we need uniforms for our people? You might want to take some of those expenses and reallocate them to more resident services, because your residents now are with you 24/7, 365. You have more interface with your residents than you've ever had in the history of their lease term. And I'll stop by saying this, is that a resident, listen friends, a resident does not become profitable until 18 months. You got to burn off payroll, you got to burn off property taxes and all of that. So resident retention is absolutely going to be essential. So remember, Kenny Rogers, know when to hold them and know how to hold them. So Jordan, back to you. Let's look at a few more slides.
Yeah, that was great stuff. And one of the things you said was competing on value, not price. I'm actually going to skip a couple slides. We'll come back, but I wanted to show this slide. This kind of gets to what Debbie's talking about. So here we're looking at Class A stabilized properties versus lease-up properties that are almost entirely Class A's as well. And so to that point, even in Class A, where people have a little more disposable income, maybe they're renters by choice, not by necessity, still though, we do see a movement toward value. And what this is showing is that stabilized Class A average effective rent is about what it was 2 years ago. There's really been no movement. And in the lease-ups, the rents are actually lower than they were 2 years ago. And we would anticipate, you know, lease-up rents, it makes sense if they're a little bit lower than stabilized Class A, because they do tend to have more lease-up concessions or incentives. But to see a gap like this is a little bit of an inversion. And so even for people who, you know, maybe they do have more of a white collar remote job that maybe is a little bit safer, maybe they do have a little bit more disposable income than in the workforce housing, still, we're seeing people go to lease-ups over stabilized Class A. And in fact, when I was writing ALN's monthly newsletter, which by the way, that's free, so check that out on our website. But I was writing the newsletter about the third quarter this year, and net absorption mostly came from lease-up properties to the extent that we had it. But if you look at the stabilized Class A's, they really got hammered. And so again, you know, people are asking themselves, well, why am I paying a premium for this existing Class A when I can go get a brand new Class A with a month and a half free incentive? And we are seeing that move. So just wanted to kind of slide that in there because it kind of perfectly fit with what Debbie was saying. So the other thing I wanted to show you on price classes was from the perspective of rent. So see that for the most part, rents are about where they were for all four price classes last year. You can see those blue bars, not much difference between the 2019 and the 2020 value. The real difference, though, once again, is with the growth rate. And I think that's just what is so obvious about this chart, particularly if you look at the Class A's. You can see, you know, over 3% rent growth through the first 9 months last year. We're still in negative territory for this year. Same thing, healthy growth for the B's last year, hovering around negative territory this year, and so on and so on. You can see that the C's and the D's did perform a little bit better relative to the A's and B's, but not relative to their performance last year. And then in the third quarter, same thing, and particularly A's and B's have gotten used to some pretty healthy rent growth. And so to see the swing there, the net change between a healthy growth rate and then a pretty substantial decline this year, that net change is pretty substantial. Whereas you can see in the Class C and D, particularly the Class C, they those properties did manage to gain a little bit, and the Ds basically were flat. So, again, this is another picture just kind of showing the price sensitivity that we're seeing. And interestingly too, really strong demand in the third quarter, and price classes C and D easily outpaced. I mean, Class C was more than 100% what it was in Q3 2019. Class D was up even more than that. That didn't equate to rent growth, but a real move toward those lower tier properties in terms of net absorption and demand. And then again here, lease concessions. You can see that Bs actually came, a little bit lower compared to 2019. But what I wanted to show you here was on the left-hand side again, basically increases across the board, and really elevated concessions for particularly classes A and B. And again, this does vary market to market. There are some sort of the expensive, dense urban markets where that Class A figure is well above 25%. So again, this is sort of a nationwide look. And then so on the right-hand side, we're looking at the change in availability just within the third quarter, and you can see the A's have had to kind of continue to move down this concession path. B's were able to actually take the foot off the gas compared to last year. But concessions, incentives, they're maintaining occupancies. That's why we haven't seen any big dips in occupancies, of course. And we also have to mention, by the way, that normally we would assume that an occupied unit is generating rent. At this point, we can't really make that assumption. We don't quite know to what extent we might have some people in these units that aren't paying rent or paying a full rent. And I'm sure you've all been monitoring the NMHC rent tracker that they put out. But what's interesting about that is they're tracking percentage of residents who made at least a partial rent payment. I may have missed it, but I think their main tracker, they're not actually showing what percent made full payments. And so we really can't assume that the full percentage of people making a partial payment made a full payment. So just keep that in mind too. We are seeing maybe a little bit of an artificial buoying of occupancy because of that. Okay, and I just wanted to finish up giving you a little bit of information, not at a national level, but talking about some specific markets. And what I really wanted to talk to you about is the profiles of markets that we're seeing that have been especially hard hit. So on the left-hand side, these are the bottom 10 markets around the country for average occupancy change in the third quarter. On the right-hand side, I limited that only to what ALN calls tier 1 markets. These are the largest markets by multifamily presence in the country, 33 markets. And what we've seen kind of throughout the second and third quarters is these markets that have struggled, especially this year, fall into a couple of pretty distinct categories. One, you're going to have your Midland Odessas, your Lake Charles, these type of, Bismarck, North Dakota is one that doesn't show up on here, but these smaller markets that are heavily concentrated on the energy sector really have been hit hard this year. So that's one, smaller markets heavily concentrated in the energy sector. The second one is these really large, dense, expensive coastal markets. So whether you're talking about Boston, the Bay Area of California, New York, Seattle, LA, these are markets that have been hit hard, especially I think the San Francisco, Oakland kind of Bay Area has had the roughest 2020. But these markets, if you think about it, not only are they really expensive, and we've seen some price sensitivity this year, but also these are areas that get a lot of both business and tourism travel. Both of those have decreased pretty significantly this year. And in these large markets like that, we tend to get higher levels of new supply, and new supply being a headwind right now to rents, these markets are therefore going to struggle a little bit more. And I do want to point out too, because I'm showing just the bottom markets here, some bright points, particularly the larger markets across the South and into the Mountain West. Atlanta had a great third quarter. DFW had a great third quarter. A market that doesn't get much attention, Detroit, actually had a strong third quarter from a demand perspective. Boise, areas like this. So really, the third. To recap this, we first have the small energy markets. We also have the large, dense, urban coastal markets, and then the third profile that we've really seen established this year would be the tourism markets. So, Orlando, Honolulu, these types of areas where they're deriving a lot of their economic activity from people traveling there, and which of course, they've not seen that this year. So what's interesting about those markets too is when you look at the small energy areas or the tourism areas, we're seeing the impact more evenly distributed across the market, particularly from a price class perspective. And that makes sense because in a market like Orlando, for example, you've got a lot of people that work at the Disney park and all kinds of tourism attractions that were laid off, furloughed, cut to part-time, et cetera. And in California, the same thing with the Disney property out there, even more so than in Florida. So in some of these high tourism markets, we're seeing rent softening and demand softening really across the spectrum. In these expensive coastal cities, we're seeing most of that concentrated in classes A and B. And there's been an uptick in demand in C and D price classes. So a little bit of a difference there, but those are sort of the three profiles of markets that we've seen kind of be hit especially hard this year. And a point that Debbie made earlier too that I wanted to touch on briefly, I guess more for our floor plans topic, but we are seeing the 3 bedrooms do pretty well. And as Debbie said, that could be people that turn an extra room into an office. It could also be households merging, and people can't afford their own 1 bedroom anymore, so they're getting roommates. And so that's something important to keep in mind as we move forward. Our industry is a seasonal one for sure. And so the next 6 months, Q4 and Q1, really not a whole lot of reason to expect some massive move in a positive direction on multifamily performance. But as we move into 2021 and Q2, Q3, the more traditionally strong quarters, if we do have a more stable economic and public health situation, you could see that a lot of those people start coming back out of the 3 bedrooms and back into the efficiencies in the 1s. So, just something to be mindful of as we sort of look ahead. And sticking with this market level look here, I wanted to show you Q3 absorption, and I've combined that with new supply. The reason I did that is because particularly for these large markets that get a lot of new supply, you can really see the double whammy effect, right? Where in a small area like Midland, Odessa, Charleston, West Virginia, yes, they lost rented units, but they didn't have any new units coming in. And so the damage is mitigated somewhat. In an area like New York or the Bay Area of California, you've got a lot of new supply coming in. At the same time, you're losing net rented units. And so the gap between those two is especially large. And if you look there at the California Bay Area, you can see that pretty closely resembles New York, but it's a smaller market than New York from a multifamily perspective. And so the effect of that on the market, the net effect, is going to be even more pronounced than what New York is doing. And last one here, same thing, just for rent. Midland, poor Midland, Odessa over there on the left-hand side, sort of in a category all their own. Really substantial losses on occupancy, rent, net rent. And that was sort of a unique situation that sort of a fun fact I used to throw out for multifamily was that the highest average rent in Texas was Midland, Odessa, as recently as like a year and a half ago. And most people wouldn't guess that, but really high rents, really high occupancies, no new supply for a pretty prolonged period of time. And right as they started delivering some new units, we got energy going back down, and then the pandemic. So they've been especially hard hit. But for the most part, you can see the rest of those markets not too far in negative territory, but again, all negative, which is something that we've really grown accustomed to not seeing in this business cycle for multifamily. And then on the right-hand side, we're looking at those the bottom 10 just of the large markets. And you can see there that California, San Francisco, Oakland, and California really sticks out. And again, for those, you're seeing a lot of those big, expensive coastal cities. And the ones that don't fit that profile, Austin would be a good example. A market that's like Austin, Denver would be another. These are areas that have been really hot markets in the last 5 years. They've had really, really strong rent growth and a ton of new supply. We've also seen a little bit of softening in those areas just because they were already dealing with, rents rising really high and a big active construction pipeline.
Right. remember, I think we touched base on this on our last meeting, Jordan, talking about Austin, the 2009 pandemic, or excuse me, situation. Austin had backed off on all development, of course, predominantly being a student housing town itself, or city, excuse me, but obviously a major player factor in the state of Texas. But they were backing up. They were very cautious. And then as things opened back up again, that development and such started to move forward. So I think, what was that, last probably 9 years, basically, of, kind of the after effect of how that where they are now, basically, as far as the end result. I wanted to kind of we've got a couple of minutes left. A question regarding the efficiency part that you were talking about, the efficiency floor plans, how they were kind of taking a hit. And I was taking notes as you were speaking. Both you and Debbie have been wonderful through this whole podcast. But, gosh, y'all, what do y'all think? For the last couple of years, developers, a lot of people have been pushing those micro units, gearing towards the age categories of who wants to live where, and people wanting to live by themselves, generation, all the different generations, generation X, Y, Zs, whatever you want to call them. This morning, I can't recall all the specifics, so I apologize, but you know where I'm going with this. They're taking a hit. So do you think basically, what are your input? Are they going back home? Like you said, they're moving to larger apartments. Before COVID hit, they were pushing the micro units, the efficiencies. And then during COVID, they were still kind of pushing it from a development standpoint. What are y'all's thoughts on that?
Jordan, I'll let you go, and then I'll add my 2 cents worth in.
Okay. Well, just briefly, I think one of the things you have to point out is that, as you say, efficiencies have really been a focus of new development for the last 5, 7 or so years. And so in an environment where these lease-up properties are softening a bit, particularly if you think about the efficiencies really have been more pronounced in the big urban cities. And so lease-ups are already struggling a little bit coming into the pandemic just because of how active the pipeline had been and the premium these rents were coming into the market at, or these units were coming into the market at. And so when you have a unit mix that is heavily skewed toward the efficiency units in new construction, naturally those efficiency units are going to be hard hit then when these big cities start struggling and when the lease-ups struggle. The other thing too is just, just anecdotally, I can say, I'm in the millennial generation. I have some friends that have these, urban efficiency type units, and they've been one in Dallas and one in Brooklyn, and they're both absolutely going crazy this year, being in their shoebox all day, every day. And so, I hesitate to say we're going to have some big paradigm shift. I think sometimes we can get a little ahead of ourselves, thinking that a blip is going to be a new trend. But having said that, I think that in terms of consumer preference, some people are going to maybe rethink their 450 unit square foot unit moving forward.
Okay.
And, just to piggyback on that, I always think about, from a marketing perspective, what else can we do with those units? And, I talk about adaptive reuse. Can we turn some of those efficiencies into more short-term rentals for, is it a seasonal rental, or how can we get some revenue? Some revenue is better than no revenue at all. And
Correct.
So we need to think about, what are we close to? And, we didn't go into that on this particular presentation, but housing cost burden, people are spending more and more of their paycheck on housing, transportation, and energy and utilities. So I think we need to be a little bit more, strategic about how we represent those efficiencies. And we need to think about, one thing that strikes me is people don't need any more commitments right now. And so I think we need to think about, let's have a shorter term lease on it. Maybe, we waive some of the fees or whatnot. The other thing is, think about this. Think about during the pandemic with more seniors, we know that that's an at-risk population. So let's think about renting those efficiencies to family members who may want to live near the grandparents, but not necessarily with them.
That's a great idea.
And then one other thing I want to say is there's this huge emergence in lifelong learning communities. So if you're near a learning center, a college, You know, even think about your own alma mater. People are offering more and more virtual learning, but at some point, some of the cohorts have a piece of their curriculum that has to be done in small group, socially distant settings.
Right.
So think about where your location is, and that's just something that I think about, those efficiencies.
I love what you said about the senior housing component, and where you were mentioning earlier as far as partnering within your community. I wonder how many conventional products are actually partnering with the seniors.
Yeah, and a guest suite. You know, I think if the holidays are coming up, think about this. You know, we are seeing statistics now that saying, you know, even the Thanksgiving meal is going to be smaller, more intimate. Think about renting those efficiencies just on a monthly basis. You know, that's 4 weekends or 4.33 weeks in a month. We've got to be creative. We've got to be creative in how we market those.
Agreed. It's better than them sitting empty.
Oh, absolutely. And the longer they sit empty, the more costs that we incur on turns and maintenance and everything else.
Absolutely. Well, y'all, we have about, you want to open it up for discussion? I know we've been talking.
Are there anything in the chat that Jordan and I can respond to? While you're looking in the chat, I do want to just sneak in my what I call my fabulous 5 recommendations for budgeting. And we didn't really, you know, expand on this, but number 1 is know your comps. Know how different you are. You write this in your notes, your unique value proposition. You've got to know your comp so well, and the comp may not be the person across the street. The comp is the place that you're losing residents to. So know your comps and have a unique value proposition. The second thing is fine tune your marketing message. You know, you could do close to everything, next to perfect. You know, think about your transportation hubs. More people, you know, are thinking about doing away with that car payment. They're not driving as much. So are you near public transportation and things like that? Just fine tune your marketing message. Number 3, I mentioned earlier, inspect what you expect. You know, make sure that even those 360 virtual tours, you know, people notice if the signs, you know, messed up in your virtual leasing. You know, there's no substitute for having a script, preparing your script, inspecting what you expect. Number 4 is, I say, evidence-based decision-making. When you go in there with your budget and you're having to, quote, defend your budget, do not say, well, I just guess. No, you do not guess, because if you guess, you may guess wrong. Go in there with evidence. Say, hey, our highest turnover was in this particular floor plan. What I'm saying, friends, is get granular. Know your facts, evidence-based decision-making. And then number 5, there's no replacement. You know, when you're sick, your mama brings you a can of soup. I tell you to bring your can of belief. You got to believe that that budget is very sound. You've made your recommendations based on the evidence, and you believe in that budget. But more importantly, you believe in your team. I say, get that can of belief.
I love it.
And actually, just really quickly here, going off of what Debbie just said, I'll take a moment here for a shameless plug as well for ALN, because it perfectly fits those 5 points. We have an entire platform, ALN Online, that is just for that. Find your actual comps, not just your neighbors. Make free, very in-depth market surveys. And also, as we all know, our inboxes are flooding right now. Everybody's wanting surveys answered and webinar invitations and all kinds of stuff right now. So it's really important to get in front of the correct person. And that's another thing that our platform does. It allows you to get the contact information for the specific person you need to be reaching out to.
And another beautiful thing, as far as I'll add to that, regarding the new development pieces in construction, when people are looking at from a development standpoint, lease up velocity, when you're looking to invest into building a product in a certain market, and of course it varies from market to market, submarket, and so forth. Well, you can actually study that, see as far as what those lease up velocities look like in each market. So we're able to provide that and consult with the client to help them with that. So obviously, if you're our website, there are complimentary reports there too for you property managers whose budgets are a little tight right now. Know that those are there in our blog posts and our market reviews on submarkets. So there's plenty of information there too that's complimentary that can help you with those that have small budgets. And of course, always reach out. We're happy to answer any questions that you may have. We're here to work for you guys.
I'm just about to say that if there's any questions we didn't get to, or if you want to ask it individually, my contact information is up there on the screen. Feel free to give me a call, shoot me an email. Happy to help you out. And as Laura said, we've got a bunch of free resources on the website as well.
Absolutely.
And man, we timed this perfectly, didn't we?
Yes. And once again, thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this with you, Debbie. I tell you what, I so enjoy the both of you so much. I just sit back and just take notes. You never stop learning.
Well, we make a great team. And again, thank you, Laura and Jordan, and thank ALN. And, you know, friends, at the end of the day, this business is based on relationships.
Absolutely.
And, you know, I can't think of any better time to have partners and strong relationships. So with that, it's been a thankful Thursday, and I'm thankful for you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone. Absolutely.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.